Hi, Stanford. How are you?
I'm hungry, hungry for knowledge.
I, I like that idea. So we've got this this title of what we're doing tonight, and it's why can't we all eat the same food when we want and how we want? There seems to be a lot of confusion around food, around diet, around what should I eat? How should I eat? Just tell me what to eat. I mean, it's one of the biggest questions I get faced again and again because, like you, food is a very important thing. So in Eastern tradition, food is amazingly important. And also in Western tradition, there's a huge amount of science around food, isn't there?
Yeah, about different food group, about different nutrition, dietitian. There's literally many, many subjects up on this, and many specialists who can land an idea on the topic. I think I just bring this up because I like to talk about food in general, as you know.
Mm. But what is so what's the basis? I mean, within so food groups, what sort of so in Western approach, we've got this idea of food groups. So there's a number of things that in the West you would consider with regard to food and also with regard to diet, because I mean, if you're thinking about it, it is that there are a huge number of variables. If and I'd like to ask a question. According to Western science, each food group is classified under a particular group, so it's like it's either a protein or it's a carbohydrate, or they have different functions. We need those things, and they have calorific properties, and we should all eat certain amounts of these every day to maintain our stasis. And I start to go through this sort of list of these various different things, but if this is the case, why can't we all eat the same foods? Because actually if you're saying to me they've got this value, if we need these combinations of these groups in these different ways, they're going to have the same effects. You're telling me on a label that it has this effect and this effect, and it has this benefit and this benefit. This is a superfood, this is this food, this is that food. So why can't we all eat the same foods? Why can't I actually create the best super diet and that's it?
So in the West, we categorize different food into according to their nutritional values. A lot of the time is like what sort of property they carry. Like carbohydrate, they're usually sweet, so they give you energy. They're great for making people happy some of the time because it stimulates endorphins sometimes. And then there's protein, which help us to maintain muscles and build a mass, especially if you're a growing person, teenagers, adolescent, you need a lot of that into your own constitution, into your own body. That's also fat, which is another way of storing energy, which is an amazing way of storing energy, in fact, because if you think about it, you can have oil. People used to use oil lamp. So that's how much brightness and energy can give in quite small quantity of things. So in a lot of ways, especially in winter, it's incredibly valuable. And there are all these other like smaller nutritional stuff, I would say, like vitamin, phytominerals, or just minerals themselves. So these are all different type of organic, inorganic substances that we need small amounts of, but they're really, really vital. Sometimes as vital as helping our cells to maintain their function or their integrities. I don't know. I'm not sure if the West recommend one regime for everyone. I think we all try to almost find that holy grail of regime that we can all follow and live happily ever after. But I think even in the West, we don't say that because yes, there's a recommended, I'm doing my quotation mark here, recommended value, a calorific value for everyone to consume according to your body type, according to your age and your sex and gender and so on and so forth. But actually how you divide that calorie is down to individual person. I think it takes a lot of trial and error in order to get there, to kind of create that combination equation for yourself. So I'm not sure.
Right, because we've as a sort of a human race, it's strange because when you start to look at every single culture, we really want to eat healthily, and the word diet. There's a suggestion, and this may be right or wrong, I don't know, but the suggestion it may originate from the Greek word dieta, which means mental and physical health. And so when we kind of start to look at this idea of diet, we for the last couple of 100 years, we've been subject to sort of lots of different fads, diet fads, this diet or that diet, or this is the way. Suddenly we there's the promise of quick weight loss plans, or plans that actually allow our body to reset itself, but for some reason, like toxicity, this idea that we are intoxic and we want to do these things, we want to lose weight. I'm just kind of, and this is all the way from sort of the early 1800s right the way through to the present day. We seem to have this sort of the repetition of these sort of strange diets, but all of them appear to be specifically about creating a hope of changing our health and also a hope of changing our appearance. So there's a kind of like almost our health and our appearance are tied up within this sort of this basis of us working with food. And when we start to look at statistics, especially in the UK, and we start to look at this, we say, we've got this idea that actually in the UK itself, we are among the worst population health in Europe due to high levels of obesity, excessive drinking, and large health inequalities. And that's a report from 2023. So when we're starting to look at this and we're starting to look at these amazing food groups, we've got these food groups. Well, why can't we all eat them? What's going on?
Well, I think for us to have almost, I'll use the word obsession for the perfect diet is actually right, because there's something mythical about it, isn't it? Because dating all the way from the Greek myth, Prometheus is the god that brings fire into our life, which is kind of the first ever diet that humans have found, in my view anyway, because we've gone from raw food to cooked food, which takes off a lot of processing need or helping us to actually digest and assimilate. A lot of the nutrition is much easier. Just to think about, if you eat some raw salad compared to cooked leaf, it's actually much easier to digest the cooked leaf compared to the raw salad. So I think it is actually quite natural for us to want to keep finding better food, just like you said, either for our health or for our beauty, how we look, how we can present to other people, or in some way even how to compare with other people, because I think we compare that a lot as well. I'm on this diet. How about you? What diet are you on? Is this one better? Is my one better? So I think that's a lot of that. I think the statistic that you gave about the UK population is so incredibly interesting, because I think I was having similar conversation with other people recently. It's almost quite sad. The neighborhood that I'm currently close by or live in at the moment, they're more and more fast food, like chain restaurant, and nothing wrong about them. But more often than not, they are what we regard as junk food. They are low quality. They're often deep fried. They're very highly calorific, but at the same time, not a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables or fresh food. And I almost wonder, actually, they are not that cheap when you come to think about it. When you cook it yourself, it's actually almost equal amounts of price. But for various different reasons, they seems to be more and more popular, at least in the neighborhood that I'm currently living in. So I don't know. I don't know why is there a shift. I'm not sure we can find an answer for it, but I think that would be interesting to discuss about as well.
Yeah, but there's been a number of discussions early this year, actually, with regard to imposing restrictions on the junk food industry. And the lack of that imposition, because it's to do with this sort of idea that we've got an ultra-free market ideology that actually everyone should be able to have access to everything and be able to choose everything, and business should be able to, big businesses shouldn't be restricted in the way that they're operating. And I think that actually one thing that you've hit the nail on the head quite perfectly is that actually most people are struggling to get access to good quality food at reasonable prices. And that means that they're turning to high calorie alternatives. And when you're looking at high calorie alternatives, and that's contributing to obesity, is, when we're looking at those sort of things, I mean, tell me more about, do you know more about sort of saturated fats within foods, or how, when you go through a process of processing foods? Because for me, when I'm looking at foods, there's a number of different variables that I look at. And when we come to look at the food itself, I'm coming to look at, maybe I'd say 5 different things. Let's say the food itself, how and where the food is actually produced. And that includes the genomes that are kind of going as part of the sort of the development of the food process. So, and also how far that food actually travels. and plus how that food is stored from that time it's harvested to where it is. So how fresh it actually is. So is it frozen immediately and then shipped and done, or is it vacuum packed, or is it, what's actually happening to this food? And then how that food is actually processed and what additives and preservatives are actually put as part of that process. Plus also the intention behind the process to prepare the food before it's actually eaten. So for me, there are sort of almost 5 variables which form part of a sort of a 20-point list with regard to diet and food that I, from my perspective, that I would look at. And those 5 are quite important because how and where food is produced. I mean, if you go into any shop, you can get an avocado all year round. Doesn't grow in the UK. I mean, I've tried many attempts, still can't grow avocados. You can get absolutely everything. And also, it's interesting that most healthy recipes tend to have avocado in them, or cashew nuts, or these are sort of things that actually have been produced outside of our country and being shipped in. So for me, how and where that food is produced, what are the contributions to that, where the seeds have actually come from, who's involved in that seed process, all of those things become very important with regard to, why is it that I can eat that and you can't eat that? Why is it that that diet works for you and doesn't work for me? But also how far this food travels, because for us, when we start to harvest food and we either immediately process it or we package it and then send it somewhere, it starts to lose something. Something starts to happen in the process. There's a difference between tomatoes, or is it tomatoes? There's a difference in tomatoes. When you grow tomatoes and you pick them and you just got that taste like a tomato. And there's a tomato that you kind of go, well, that doesn't taste of anything at all. There's no taste within it. And so for me, how far it travels and the time between it's in how it's stored on that process, and the time between when it's produced and also the time when it hits something. So the environment it goes into, does it go into a nitrogen environment? How does that actually affect the food? And also how that food is actually processed. So for me, it's interesting to, and you'll know much more about this with regard to this idea of ultra processed foods and the effect that ultra processed foods have on us. And that means that you've got the food in a format. You're right, it's cooked, but it's transformed several times. Rather than just being cooked in from one state to another state, it's actually been transformed several times into another state, and we're used to that state and has an effect on us. Can you explain some more about ultra processed foods?
So I think some of the ad that came out on my social media recently talked about this type of breakfast substitute where there's high protein and all the good fats and not a lot of carbohydrates, and it's great, especially if you are a bodybuilder, you are training to have a certain body type. It's a really good substitute and it's quick to mix, because I think usually comes as a powder and you put it into a specialist bottle and then you can mix it very quickly and you can drink it or eat it very, very quickly as well. I think that kind of comes to similar concept of what you just talked about in terms of ultra processed food, because in some way almost take the food that we can have into literally the group that I described in the earlier on when we first begin talking, is like into protein, into carbohydrate, into fat, either saturated or non-saturated, doesn't matter. And then according to what is recommended as a proportion and calories, I portion them so that you can have almost these elements of a diet put into powder form, and you can reconstitute it with water or in some way very, very quickly. I often do wonder if they are actually healthy or not, because I think it's a really, really good and quick way for us to absorb nutrient, because they've been so broken down in a way that you don't actually need a lot of digestions involved.
But can we absorb them? Can we actually absorb them?
So from a Western perspective, you can, but I'm not sure it's very palatable. And I use that word very, very carefully, because I remember as a medical trainee, I think I went to a gastroenterology ward where some people after surgery or one sort or another, part of their bowels and guts is missing, and they're actually on similar kind of diets. They're on these modular diets or elementary diets, which actually the smell of it or the taste of it is not very, very palatable. So maybe in some way, yes, it is broken down, pre-broken down for our body. So actually we supposedly can digest it and absorb it much quicker. But in my head, I'm not sure I would want to eat much of it because actually it's not very, very appetizing for me. So I have to say I never tried these ultra processed food myself. How about you in yoga Ayurveda perspective? Can we digest it? Can we absorb them?
Well, what if we come to, I've got this kind of list in my head of 20 different things, and 5 of them are around actually the foods themselves. Because for me, there's a number of the different things that we need to take into account. The first is actually the individual person's constitution. You and I are different. When we eat together,
yeah.
I marvel at all the different foods you eat. I mean, I cannot believe how much you eat. I'm seriously.
And the quantity.
Yeah, the quantity, the quality. I mean, it's unbelievable. I just cannot.
And the speed.
Yeah, I cannot believe it. And almost in a way, I want to, but there's something, I really want to keep up, but I'm just so full after the first, after the first 10 courses, I just can't keep up with you.
You can keep that going.
So for me, there's a difference with foods with individual constitution, and we've discussed individual constitution before. It means that there's probably about 8 different constitutions that we need to consider with regard to different foods, and some foods will suit one constitution and not another constitution. And this is a whole area in its own right, according to Yoga and Ayurveda. But also the next thing is that, like you mentioned, the word digestion and also absorption. And it's a little like we've seen in the market suddenly this movement into prebiotics. We used to have probiotics, but now we've got prebiotics as well. And actually prebiotics are very successful. And in the Eastern tradition, they break it down, digestion, into 3 different areas. Pre-digestion, so the way that the liquids sort of start to break food down, the digestive process itself, and then post-digestion, what actually happens after it's been broken down. So these 3 functions need to work as part of this. And that then creates an effect on how we can work with diet. It's why some people they can go out every night, drink 6 pints of beer, have a Kentucky Fried Chicken or anything, and they're absolutely fine with it. But someone else, it just wouldn't work with them. So also how the metabolic fibers, can they actually, like you say, can they actually absorb what's being put into the system? And so in the Eastern side of it, we look at things slightly differently. We look at this idea that actually it takes 28 days for a food substance to actually, or a food category, to go right the way through the system and to go into the system. So it's not as instantaneous as, I have this pure protein drink, or I have this other thing, and then that gives me this. There's a knock-on effect that happens as it goes deeper and deeper and deeper into the system. And the food that we choose, this is the 4th thing for me, the food that we choose, is it appropriate or not for the first 3? Is it appropriate or not for the individual constitution? Does it work with my pre-digestion, digestion, post-digestion process? Does it work with the fire that I've got within me? Can I actually absorb it? And all of this is done according to the taste of the food. And the taste is the key influencing factor within the Eastern tradition. So the first is, to understand this idea of, what happens with regard to sweet foods. And sweet foods help to build the body up. And I think that our taste actually over the last few centuries has become sweeter, hasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I think even in the soy sauce, it's becoming sweeter, which is slightly ironic because soy sauce is meant to be salty. But I think they're using more and more of like a caramel flavoring to add the darkness of the color. So I think something that meant to be savory is more sugary as well.
Right. So, but sweet taste will have a number of things. What it will do is it will increase the mass. That's what it's there for. It's there to increase the mass of the body. But it's not just sugars and honeys, and it's also milks and rice and wheat and grains. These are all sweet. But we,
Hmm.
almost in a way that the grains we don't consider to be sweet, but they increase the mass of the body. So their view is very much based on the taste of the food rather than the category that the food comes into. So it's almost that several different categories of food that you mentioned earlier come into the same taste.
Would that include sugar substitute as well? Or these sorbitol and things that we now have in our fizzy drinks. Would that
100%.
include the sugar? Okay.
100%. Yeah, because it's all based on the taste. And that for me is the really interesting thing. I mean, it's really interesting.
Absolutely, because on one hand, we've been told because it's not actually sugar, it hasn't got a calorie, being
Mm.
Ayurveda, because it's tasting sweet, actually will still have the similar energetic effect almost that
Mm.
help us to build mass later on down the line.
But what they do is they break it out slightly differently. They say that actually based on this quality, like the sweet quality, it gets its taste in the system through the mouth, but also the digestion happens at different places within the system itself. And that is fascinating because it means that something sweet, actually the digestion happens within not just the mouth, but also within the esophagus, within the stomach itself. And the assimilation is actually within the digestive system. So it's when we start to see, and I say this is that this system is kind of like it's quite a complicated system of understanding how food comes to nourish you. And in fact, I think a number of the processes that we go through within our current food sourcing and use actually, I think, blocks the way that food has an effect on us.
Hmm. Well, I think the Western science confirm about the digestion of carbohydrate as well, where
Mm.
because when you said earlier on, when we think about grain, we don't think of them as sweet, but actually I've always think of them as sweet because, I eat a lot of rice. I've been eating a lot of rice since I was a kid. But as a kid, I often just put the food in my mouth and just keep it in my mouth and don't chew, or chew a little bit, but don't swallow. Actually, if you try to do that with grain,
Mm.
and you will realize that the saliva in your mouth actually start breaking down these more complex carbohydrate, actually give you a
Mm.
very, very sweet taste. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of Western science to back up what you just said as well.
Mm.
And I think what's interesting as well, thinking about what we have gone through so far, is actually some of these ultra processed food, a lot of the time to make them more palatable, they tend to have a sweet taste as well.
Either that or salty.
That is true. I did
So
that on salty.
they either go in those two directions, and both of those are accumulative according to Eastern tradition. Okay,
Hmm.
so salty is exactly the same, but it's slightly different. Salty, actually, digestion happens for salty in the duodenum,
Mm-hmm.
different from sweet. So that I find that quite interesting. So it's according to that.
Yeah.
So
And the funny thing is because they are a lot of nutrition supposedly very, very quickly into the system and easily absorbed.
mm,
Actually, then over time, if we rely on them as meal substitute almost, like the ones that I saw in the social media and saying that we can replace breakfast with them,
mm,
I wonder if our body would start changing accordingly. Because in order to digest and actually balance out the amounts of nutrition that we absorb from these food, we have to actually do a lot of things in return, like this breakfast substitute I talked about, it market for people who are bodybuilder who has actually a lot of exercise in their daily routine. But whenever that tends to stop, I think all of these nutrition will have to then be stored in some way, which our body knows storage is best by turning them into fat, which is kind of what you said earlier on about obesity.
is I mean, it's just a question to you. I'm just thinking about this right now with regard to mono diet. So
Mhm.
if you're taking these, let's say these breakfast substitutes, or you eat the same thing on a regular basis. So whether it's ultra processed, whether it's a breakfast substitute, is it actually what I would consider to be a mono diet? So it's the same thing appearing again and again in the system, which means that the system actually craves and needs a whole spectrum of things, doesn't it?
Yes. But at the same time, I think it will also create disease because a mono diet tends to mean that we'll have an imbalance of nutrition that we absorb.
Yeah.
So there will be some sort of vitamin or mineral or something that's lacking. I think from human history, if you just look at our teeth, we have canines, we have molars, so we're designed to be able to eat everything because that's how our diet has been, evolutionary speaking. We have been gatherers and hunters, so we eat both vegetables, fruit, fish, meat, whatever we can hunt and get our hands on. And I think in a lot of ways, our body are developed that we need a very diverse amount of nutrition. Obviously, everyone may be slightly different, but I think this diversity actually is very important in the diets as well.
Right. So actually the body is developed to be diverse, which means that, something like a seasonal diet is supposed to be the best kind of diet for you. So it's actually just being able to move through the seasons and just be able to get what is available locally, seasonally. And that makes, it fits very well with what you're saying, but it goes against a lot of the fad diets that we're talking about, which are to do with, fast results for health or so I think there's all looking very good. So, but also you mentioned the word meat as well, is that there tends to be a sort of a movement away from meat at the moment too, as part of a diet.
I think I just had another thought. If we are truly going to be developed towards a mono diet, then at some stage we have to evolve more like cow, because cow tend to eat only one thing, which is grass. So in order to adapt to that, all through the season, all through the years, over their life, they develop 4 stomachs. So their body is very, very specially and specifically designed in a way so that they can follow the same diet throughout, and they have a very specific bacteria group in their gut and all the rest of it. I think we are developed slightly different ways. So that's why I think maybe it's meat, maybe it's vegetables, maybe it's fruits, fish, seafood, whatever it may be, or grains. We need this diversity a little bit. Can we truly and entirely substitute one food group with another? I'm not sure, because I haven't actually done that experiment myself. I know lots of people who are vegetarian or vegan or pescatarian who doesn't eat meat, and they live very happy lives. And I think that's very, very good. But I think it is possible for survival, but what sort of effect would it have on the body? I don't know. Yoga Ayurveda say anything about that?
Well, we get 200 different types of meat given in Ayurveda with the qualities, plus also the effect they have on individual constitutions and how they affect pre-digestion, digestion, and post-digestion. And so actually there isn't a sort of an advocation for a meat-free diet. It's looking at actually the effect that meat has on an individual. And I think that's interesting. So with regard to, let's say, if you take a chicken, whether it's regard to the brown meat of a chicken or the white meat of a chicken, and which person type of constitution will favor either of those things. And I think that in the West, we look very much at a chicken. We have chicken breast, because that's supposed to be the best part of the chicken. And then we have, the chicken breast battered or fried or grilled or sliced, or, we have it
steamed.
You steam it. But again, the cooking process is so interesting because, again, the cooking process also affects the way that we can absorb and work with the food. So when you mention things like steaming, on one end of the spectrum, you've got something that's slow cooked, which I think is very important. But at the other end of the spectrum, you've got something that's very, very quickly cooked, microwaved, almost, at the other end of the spectrum. And so when we're starting to look at how the food is processed and how it's actually prepared for us to be able to eat, I think it's the cooking aspect becomes important, because we would look at that transformation process of cooking would also affect the way that we can absorb and work with that food.
Well, you know this because I don't actually have a microwave. I haven't owned a microwave for many years, but I do use one because I use them at work. I just don't use them at home because other than reheating for my lunch, I don't usually have any use for them. I often do wonder, because the food that come out of the microwave always tend to taste slightly drier in my mouth. I don't know why. Maybe because it's the evaporation of the water after the vibration created by the microwave. Clearly, I've given it some thought. But yeah, it always seems to taste drier. And it hasn't altered the taste too much unless I really overcook it with the microwave, like
Mm.
almost burning it. I do wonder what sort of energetic change would it give from microwave?
One of the one of the other things that we look at, apart from the taste quality and the sixth taste that we look at, is the quality or texture of the material that we're eating itself. So whether it's rough, whether it's smooth, whether it's heavy, whether it's light, whether it's hot, whether it's cold. And you just mentioned that actually it feels a bit dry. There's almost this drying aspect that comes out of a microwave. And opposite to that is that, when you kind of poach something or roast something or you slow cook something, there's a kind of like almost there's a beautiful moisture that's within everything.
Succulent.
And so this also becomes another important quality that for me, it's almost number 6 in the things that I look at, is that it's the quality of the food itself that creates that effect. So is it dry? Because what the dryness will do is it will pull liquid out of you. It will change the liquids within your body. It will have a different taste within you. So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because for me that's also something very, very important as part of this.
Just out of interest, is color ever a consideration in your, considering about food and diet?
So funny you should mention that, because there's a number of different ideas with regard to food colorings, or having brightly colored plate of food, or staying away from beige foods and only going towards sort of, greens and reds and this type of thing. But I also think that this links very much to the next thing that I think is key to the overall diet process, and that's to do with the emotional mental state of the person. And that's, for me, the sort of the seventh thing that I consider, because it means that it sounds very bizarre, but if you eat when you're angry, it's different from when you're eating when you're happy.
Almost it changes the taste, because when you're angry, almost everything would taste quite bland. Whereas when you're happy or not angry, at least I found I can actually feel the individual taste much more.
And for me, this is almost gives an insight into the basis of a lot of rituals, like saying grace before we have a meal, by talking with friends and having, you're welcoming guests and giving them lots of food, so that actually
grateful.
This type of thing, so that what we then start to do is we start to enjoy the food together that we've got, and it helps with regard to the digestive process, rather than eating sort of on our own, or eating when we've got a lot of emotion caught up within us. So for me, the emotional aspect is paramount to, asking this question, why can't we all eat the same thing? This is part of the process. It's all part of the parcel of this. And so it's not just about the individual constitution. It's not just about the pre-digestion, the digestion, the post-digestion. It's not about the metabolic fire. And also how we choose foods for those things, not just about the taste, and also about how we come to cook it, or the quality of the food, but also the emotional and mental state that the person actually has. And I think that is absolutely key as part of this, because there are rituals to change our mood, to change our emotional state, to help us to process emotions, so that actually, almost the breaking down, the cooking of our food is almost like the breaking down, the cooking of our emotions. And, on the one hand, we can cook our food effectively or prepare it effectively, but can we do the same with what's going on inside of us as well? Because we're combining these two things together, this kind of food and our emotions, and we're putting them together. And I suppose it's where we start to get these ideas of eating based on emotion as well, don't we?
I was going to say, I think you put out a very, very interesting idea, which is emotions while we're eating. Because as previously stated, there are a lot of fast food restaurants around me at the moment. And often I'm actually quite tempted. And a lot of the time I can resist, but sometimes every now and then I kind of almost want to treat myself to the taste. Now that I'm doing this knowing that actually I probably will feel awful afterward because I don't know why, maybe it's my constitution. I actually can't eat a lot of deep fried food. It makes me feel very sluggish. It makes me feel very heavy in this kind of stomach area for a long time afterward. I find it very, very difficult. But every now and then I do quite enjoy the taste of it and the texture of it sometime as well. So I order some. I think up until recently, I decided actually, you know what, every now and then, even I know that it's just a bit of short-term pleasure and long-term slightly more suffering. I decided to not eat the gill with it. Because sometimes, do you know what I mean? You buy the Happy Meal, you bring it home. You're so excited when you're queuing. It's like, oh, which one can I get? What am I going to get? What drinks do I get with this? You sit down, actually, as soon as you open the bag, it's like, oh, should I be doing this? Is this the right thing to do? Because you can start seeing the grease on the bag and, start getting that smell. It's like, But then it's so tempting to start eating it. And as you're eating it, there's a bit of guilt that you kind of swallow with every bite. I decided to cut out that guilt in the process because I realized that's probably more calorific than the actual fries I'm having. I don't know what you think about that.
But also, I mean, you're a doctor, you work in psychiatry, you also come across a lot of eating disorders as well as part of this. And if we start, if I start to sort of reflect on different statistics and different things around this, you start to get sort of ideas around how we're coming to eat and almost that we get. I think there is a statistic that comes out from 35% of normal dietists progress to actually having pathological dieting, and 20 to 25% of those individuals actually then go on to go into eating disorders. So it's almost dieting is kind of like a gateway to, almost combined with some emotion and sort of, I don't know, you're the psychiatrist. So
I think since something like 2013, actually, orthorexia has been recognized. Okay. It may not be in a proper eating disorder diagnosis yet, or at least it will be subcategorized under the non-specific one, eating disorder. But actually, orthorexia, which means the person really tends towards or very obsessively eat very clean diet, whatever that may mean, according to the person's belief and cultural values, so on and so forth. And actually reject all other food and develop specific dietary type can actually be considered as a mental health disorder. And you're right, the correlation then later on developed towards bulimia and anorexia is much higher. And I think that interesting part is especially anorexia, because I think that is a illness that has fascinated media quite a lot about 20 years ago or so, because there's a lot of celebrity who promote the awareness about eating disorder, which is actually very, very, I don't want to use the word sad, but actually quite life limiting disease, because actually it not only affect the weight, but actually because how it affect the diet, the person who have been affected by eating disorder can be incredibly limited in how they interact in a lot of ways. But actually, if you look at statistics of that illness, of this mental health illness, actually it has largely been unchanged for a very long time. Actually, it has a spike, according to some media trying to portray as like certain celebrity kind of increases the prevalence and incidence of it. Actually, it has been largely similar. So this illness seems to be side by side with human for a very long time.
Because food is all about nourishment, isn't it? It's about not just physical nourishment, it's about mental and emotional nourishment. And dieting is if we think about it, it's about health and it's about wellness. It's finding the right diet. What's the right diet that works for us is about this sort of this wellness aspect of things. But when we start to use a diet, we're looking at a diet to sort of change something about our health, or we're using a diet to actually change an appearance of ourselves. There is one statistic that I kind of am interested in, that 65% of those people that go on a diet actually gain everything back again that they kind of lost within 3 years. And it's only 5% of people within obesity, within working with a diet to actually change something with health, actually keep weight off and get to a healthy place. So I find that a very, very interesting statistic.
Well, I think you probably know this more than me because in Yoga Ayurveda, it kind of not categorized, but it gave out three different constitution where people have three slightly different builds. One is kind of quite thin, one's quite muscular, one's quite a bit more well-rounded as body type. But in the West, we kind of use body mass index as one categorizing thing, rather you are underweight within the normal limits or you're overweight or obese. I think this range in some way also gives us an idea. Actually, there should be a range of human body types. Some people tend to be slightly slimmer, some people tend to be slightly more plump, and I think that is a natural body type. I remember years ago I was reading about this study where actually if you leave a person eating their own diet and their own exercise routine, they tend to fall back into their own weight within the space of about 5 years. And there may be small fluctuation up and down, but they usually settle into one weight. I think that kind of confirms what you just said as well. So if you put an artificial diet, meaning it's something deviated from that person's norm or not natural habit, there will be a tendency that unless they keep sticking to this diet forever and a day, they will tend to go back to their original weight because that is where their body type tends to come from. And
there's numbers of flaws with regard to BMI as well, isn't there? So already, it doesn't take into account, how much fat versus muscle, someone actually has, and also the distribution of fat on someone's body. And also the metabolic health as well. So it really doesn't.
It doesn't often correct for ethnicity. Some countries started to do it, but actually it doesn't correct for it a lot of the time, or for bodybuilders.
Yeah.
I was thinking as well, earlier on, you keep talking about how to prepare for food. What's the intention behind it? That was the question why I asked about the color. Because actually a lot of chefs think about the taste a lot more, the texture, the color, the presentation, how appetizing everything is. And also you were talking about how seasonal food is so important because actually eating according to season around the surrounding is incredibly hyped up. I don't know how to describe a chic at the moment, isn't it? Because where people, there's this sort of seasonal menu that coming through in a lot of high class restaurant where chef want to change the ingredients accordingly. They will change the dishes according to season or according to local produce. And as in concept, actually, I think Yoga Ayurveda has for a long time, but also I know in Chinese heritage, from my Chinese heritage, we have a lot because we meant to be eating according to the season. We have 24 different seasons in a year. Seasons as in every 2 weekly, we give them a special name describing what usually happened in these 2 weeks. And actually there is a recommended food and how you eat accordingly. Like say, right now it's been more rainy than in diets. They will have food that actually encourage the body to excrete water so that you don't accumulate too much. So you don't feel too heavy, you don't feel achy, you don't feel tired. So I don't know, in some way, I find this concept that we're coming around to very, very familiar because that's what I've been growing up with. When I was a kid, my mum would often cook certain type of soup according to season, and that's what seems to be everyone recommend in the market because those are the type of food that they sell in the wet market. Is all quite locally produced.
Correct, and not only just this, but it's also how to get the right food combination. Because quite often as a chef is that we want to create something exciting with almost contrasting or tastes, tastes that kind of bounce off each other and give something different. But actually the food combination can actually cause a problem. And in Eastern tradition, they look at those food combinations to avoid. So, keeping fruit away from dairy products, keeping meat away from dairy products. And so if I consider, I was at a food festival at the weekend and there was just combinations of, fruits with dairy or meat with so suddenly we had these kind of combinations which created this sort of these agitations.
Hold on a second. Isn't tomato a fruit?
Yeah, but I'm talking about pineapple with yogurt. I mean, come on, who cooks pineapple and puts it with yogurt? An exciting chef maybe, but actually, and it did taste fairly good, but I mean, it creates an effect. It affects the digestive system.
Yes. I'm also quite interested in the other tastes as well, because I think I read an article recently where it talked about how the five tastes that almost in the West or in Chinese culture we classify. So we have the sweet one where everyone likes, because it's kind of the reward center. It's something sweet like a fruit or flower, nectar. These usually are things that is a reward, makes us happier, as I said. Salty is good because it helps us to kind of gain the umami flavor from food, and make it taste better from a plate. But actually, from the older times, people tend to stay away from sour food, but also stay away from bitter food. I think sourness is because they tend to say that the food has gone off, so that turns slightly sour, and bitterness tend to signify food that has slightly poisonous properties in them.
But when you look at it, okay, sour foods, things like fermented foods, and kimchi has made an absolute, a storm with, and kombucha as well. These are sour, these are fermented foods. So, they actually help with regard to the digestive fire within the body. They provide a warmth and a moistness. They're heavy and they're stable. They're very. Sour is very positive, but on the other end of the spectrum, opposite to it is bitter. And tell me, coffee, bitter. Do you see what I mean? So actually, and things like aloe vera. Aloe vera. People drink aloe vera juice for stomach health, don't they, and gut health. And so it's bitter. It's got this kind of quality to it, which is actually it's quite dry. Turmeric as well is bitter. Okay, it's dry, it's cold, it's it's cooling in effect, and so we use these things to actually cool the system down. So
question, is wine sour and is chocolate bitter?
Why is sorry?
Is wine sour?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. I always thought that there was a lot of sweetness within wine.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of sugar within wine. But it's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. I'll just be honest.
I thought it depends on the vintage.
Hmm.
And chocolate, would it classify as bitter?
Yeah, it's a stimulant, isn't it?
Mm.
It is a stimulant. Yeah, it's a very, very strong stimulant. It's a little like like cacao. When you remove the chocolate and you go towards the cacao, you just actually take the cacao, and I mean it is an absolute stimulant. You mustn't have it after 12 o'clock in the day. I mean, it really is like having a triple espresso coffee.
Interesting. And does this taste astringent in Ayurveda as well, which is slightly less familiar idea to me?
Yeah, it's like pomegranate, alfalfa sprouts, these these type of things. Chickpeas, unripe banana, these sort of things. Again, it's a cooling thing. It's dry, it's cold, it's light, it's stable. It allows the system to helps to eliminate the system. Now, what they're advocating rather than one thing, actually have all six as part of a meal. And you had a good balanced meal when you have all six as part of it. And I find that very interesting. So it means that you sort of, we get into a situation where we move away from that mono diet that we were having, where we were having, shredded wheat for breakfast, a sandwich for lunch, and pasta for dinner, to suddenly come of having to think about actually within each meal, we've got a sweet taste, a sour taste, a salty taste, a pungent taste, a bitter taste, and a astringent taste. Pungent being, things like black pepper, these sort of things, ginger.
So like a good chef, you have to really think about the whole meal as a whole instead of just one dish at a time.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing that you just brought up is about also the frequency of eating as well, because you said you gave an idea of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I think please, anyone who is listening to this podcast, please give feedback and tell me if I'm wrong. But I think that the idea of free meals that they actually come around the time Industrial Revolution, because I think people used to just break their fast, hence breakfast. And then later on, they have a later meal called supper or tea or dinner, whatever name you want to call it. I think lunch is in some way invented because people go into work, which means they have less time in the morning to have a bigger breakfast, which will usually sustain them all through the day. They have to rush in order to get into work, so they have something small. And for all the employers, they have to give their workers some time off during the day. So during this kind of 8 hour working day, somewhere in the middle, that needs to be a break. So they introduce a food break in the middle.
Right.
And later on, when they've gone home, when they have work all day, they're hungry again. So they have the late dinner time.
It's so unfortunate, isn't it? Whereas in the East, they look at food in a different way. They look at it of creating the structure based on what you've been doing, what your role is, what you actually need, and then also your constitution. So there's one constitution that needs to eat maybe 5 times a day. There's another constitution that needs to eat maybe 3 times a day. Another constitution 2 times a day. So actually what we start to get is an understanding of, firstly, we're back again to this thing. What's the individual constitution? What's going on pre-digestion, digestion, and post-digestion? How their metabolic fire is, what they can absorb, the actual taste of the food, but their emotional, mental state. We've got the time of year, but we've also got the consistency of the timing of the food rhythm and the activities the person has actually done and what they're actually coming to do, plus also the location they're in. Because sometimes what happens is that as a person, you'll be in one location and you'll eat 3 meals a day or 2 meals a day. But suddenly what will happen is that you'll change location, you'll be doing different activities, and you need to increase the food that you're taking in.
And the requirement may also change according to the geography of where you are. I remember a few years ago when I climbed Kilimanjaro, the food was provided by the group that organized the climbing. There's a lot of soup in the diet because we need to keep our hydration up because we're doing a lot of climbing, walking, hiking in altitude. So that actually we have to make sure that we don't get dehydrated. Right. It will exacerbate mountain sickness. So I think you're absolutely right.
I'll tell you a story about that sometime. So I did the same, and we had a lot of soup. We had a soup called Leeksy soup, and we tried. It was so delicious, and we tried to get the recipe at the end, and we kept asking for the recipe for Leeksy soup, and eventually we were taken around to where they were making the soup, and we were introduced to the chef called Leeksy, and it was his soup, and there was actually no recipe at all, and we were under this impression that they were making, all those other things. So. Yeah, it was.
Did you bring him back so that he can make the soup for you?
We're trying to. And so when we start to look at this whole thing, for me, it starts to begin to answer the questions about diet. Why can't we all eat the same diet? I mean, it's got the same properties to it. It's got the same nutritional values to it. But actually, for us, there's huge numbers of variables that we need to consider. I need to consider my constitution. I need to consider what's going on with me emotionally. I need to understand the food that I'm being offered or the food that I'm preparing and how I'm preparing it. I need to look at the time of year. I need to look at really what I've done and where I'm going to. I need to begin to understand what it is I actually like, because there's nothing worse than eating stuff because you think you ought to eat it rather than actually, oh, it's really good for me, so I think I'm going to have it. I can't, you need to like it. You need to like your food. Otherwise, it's just a disaster.
I'm loving this because in order to answer the question, why can't we all eat the same food, same amount, same frequency and feel good about ourselves? The answer is because we are different, because we're not the same people. So we can't all eat the same thing. That's incredible.
Right. It's good to speak to you this evening.
Too. Speak to you next time.
Look forward to it. Thank you so much.